This is the voice from beyond saying that I will get started soon. Making sure I ironed out all the kinks. Realized my music was muted this whole time, so that's not going to help. Cool. Everything looks good. I will eventually have a nice page to have up front. Trying out this whole live streaming thing. This is something I have been meaning to do more with California WFP. There's a lot of information that I read on a daily basis, and I feel like it'd be good to share it with folks as they just really hear about what we're doing and what we're working on, and some of the things that often aren't covered if you don't see it on social media. If you do see it on social media, maybe a wrong interpretation if there's a mainstream media spin on it. I just kind of wanted to go over everything. These are just random articles I found throughout the day, actually. If you have other suggestions on what I should talk about, what I should bring up, feel free to drop them in the chat. Also, conversely, if you don't want to do it in the chat and you are on our Discord, you can shoot me a message on Discord and just send a link there. I really am interested to see what we can do with this. This is, again, just the very first trial run of this. I'm hoping quality looks good, sound is nice, volume is good. My camera seems to be all good. The WFP light in the back is not on because it's still daytime. But I really wanted to talk about what it is that we can focus on, and what we're seeing come up in California. One of the first articles I actually saw today, and this is a whole narrative thing that we're seeing with Democrats and Republicans alike, especially more on the conservative side for the Democrats, this whole property crime discussion on like, oh, how can we deal with this uptick in property crime and what that looks like. One of the funny things that I think about this whole conversation is it ignores the larger context of it. One, folks have already forgotten about COVID when they talk about these things. They're like, oh, COVID clearly was an anomaly. This isn't something that pertains to here and now in 2024. It's kind of wrong. That's not going to get you anything and get you understanding of what actually the situation looks like. One of the things here is it takes this whole article talking about how they want to crack down on property crime and kind of look about Prop 47. All of this, it's not until, and I'll go through the rest of it later, but it's not until almost towards the very end that you get this little sentence by itself. That the data shows property crimes have risen in recent years while remaining well below historic highs. That is, I think, the big context of this whole piece is like, if you really look at where things were before and where things are now, you see that it's a really big, stark difference in terms of how we actually perceive what property crime looks like. Just because it's reported a lot more doesn't necessarily mean that it actually is high as opposed compared to previous years. But kind of talking about this whole issue really comes down to a misunderstanding of what the issue really is in terms of like who's responsible for dealing with this, as if we're talking about the whole property crime issue. There's two camps of people largely. It's like there's folks that are focused on, oh, Prop 47 is an issue. When I was working on the Chase Boudin anti-recall campaign, we would hear so many things about Prop 47, which, if you are unfamiliar with it, was a way to lower the sentencing for certain crimes, especially around property crimes, to address mass incarceration. Again, it was a good thing. And so but it's so misunderstood, whether intentionally or not, and conflated with different things, that when folks think of Prop 47, they think an individual is responsible for this. So when we were talking about the Chase Boudin campaign, folks would say, oh, Chase is responsible for getting folks out of prison early, or they're not having lighter sentences now. All of this came from Prop 47, and this was supported by a lot of Democrats back when it was initially voted on in 2014, exactly a decade ago now. I'm forgetting that it's 2024. And this whole conversation really ignores the reality that the property crimes are still going down. Mass incarceration is still something that we need to deal with, and recategorizing folks in a different, brand new kind of framing of crime isn't going to solve the issue whatsoever. And if I didn't mention it earlier, feel free to chime in the chat. I believe you still have to subscribe in order to chat. It's our way of keeping the trolls at bay wherever they may linger and lurk. But this is a space where you can talk, chat. I'm here to talk. I just don't want to be the only one talking. If you have insight or other thoughts about these things. So this is Newsom's approach to this. As everyone and their grandmas know, Newsom is definitely trying to elevate his public persona on a national level. So this is definitely a way that he would like to pivot, as expected, more to the center to deal with what this perceived issue is. And I say perceived issue every single time because it's not something that is based in the reality of how we are dealing with property crime in California. And nationwide is a different story, but specifically in California. And I think I always point back to one of the articles that I saw, and I will find it somewhere here when I get the chance, about the big realtors talking about how much they lose to theft and how much they over-exaggerated the degree to which theft is a big part of why they're losing money, why they're closing stores, all of these different things. They're like, oh, the narratives in favor of big crime is taking over California, it's doing all these things, when in reality there's a lot of wage theft and issues that kind of they conflated together to really exacerbate what they like to talk about as the crime issue. This is not to say that crime is not a thing. This is obviously a thing. There's a lot of high-profile instances where folks are like, oh, I've heard about the smash and grabs in San Francisco or different parts of the Bay Area. I think it's Walnut Creek or something. Again, the news likes to sensationalize all this stuff. This is things that they like to talk about. This isn't something that really focuses on the core issue of Prop 47 and a lot of these changes. And one of the important things when we talk about this stuff is not to conflate what Prop 47 does with what we're seeing right now. There's a change in differentiation between who is really working on this stuff and who's the professional crime people, as they like to put it. But all of this ends up leading to more incarceration if we don't address the root issues here. So I think it's important when we think and look and read upon these things that this, yes, is the headline talking about how we can, quote unquote, address the retail theft and auto burglaries and stuff. But in the larger context of knowing what the property crimes look like, it's super important to know where we actually are. And it talks about how Democrats are on the defense with all this stuff, and organized theft is this large, uncontrollable force. And we have millions upon hundreds of millions of dollars being spent to and given to law enforcement to then do nothing with that to address retail crime. So there's like two sides of this where, okay, money has already been spent in excess amounts to folks that should, whether they will or not is a different story at this point, but whether they should go after prosecuting retail crime. That's clearly not the case at this point. The cops get all the money and then do nothing with that in terms of really tackling what they like to say a lot is an issue within the court system, and because of Prop 47 and stuff. So that was just one of the articles I saw from today. Again, it's funny the framing that they have for all these things. The other one too is something that a lot of our elected officials across the state are working towards, and this is a big thing that again has come up because of COVID. It was a big fight before, but now it's becoming even more prevalent as a lot of the eviction moratoriums are fading and have gone at this point, and now things are kicking back into where they were before. This whole right to counsel piece, and tenants getting right to counsel, is a big piece of what working families, especially here in California, are supporting our electeds on. We had a town hall back in almost a year ago now, back in San Jose with Councilmember Peter Ortiz in San Jose, where he was talking about introducing right to counsel for tenants in the city of San Jose, which is, I believe, the 10th largest city in the country, with just shy over 1 million individuals living within its borders. So this is one thing that when I was reading the article, I was like, okay, I'm familiar with all these issues, but just seeing how stark the differences are numerically in terms of folks getting access to these things, folks not getting access, is just unbelievable. It's mind-blowing, honestly. San Francisco is one of the only cities that guarantees tenants access to an attorney in the eviction proceedings. That I knew already, but it being one of the only 17 cities nationwide, plus 4 states, but I'm talking about cities right now, that have launched right to counsel programs since 2017. And this is an idea since 2017. It's something that almost seems like a no-brainer when you think about having equal access to an attorney, especially with an issue like housing. It is mind-blowing that, and it talks about it here later, it's like nationwide, fewer than 5% of tenants in eviction cases are represented by attorney, compared to more than 80% of the landlords. That is a huge difference between who gets representation and who doesn't within the court system. And this is something that I think we need to inform folks on a lot more, I would say, for sure. Like, hey, this is something that needs to be addressed. A lot of renters, I am a renter myself. If I ended up in an eviction case, I'm shit out of luck kind of here where I live, because our city doesn't have this issue, this program. So these things are such low-hanging fruit. And once we get folks into office, asking them, reminding them, seeing what they can do to at least introduce this, have a conversation, host a town hall. Even hosting a town hall is a good first step with someone. Like, hey, this is something that we're working on. This is something that we're working towards. What can we do to get this passed in the city of X, Y, or Z? It's never going to be an easy fight. The landlord association and everyone that supports them will fight tooth and nail against this. I can't imagine how long the fight and how ugly the fight was for San Francisco to pass this. But this being something that needs to be done. The 5% of tenants in eviction cases being represented by an attorney is unconscionable, honestly. It's something that we as Californians, we as people need to just take a hard look at and just like, this is not something that is acceptable for us. And this is never, no, I don't want to say never, but this is hardly because of something that they've done themselves. The rent, you get to the whole issue of, oh, let's raise rent by 15% this upcoming year. Oh, let's renovate this apartment and then not move back into it. Let's do a bunch of different things that tenants and renters don't have the protections from. So when the landlords come around, like, hey, this is something that I want to do, I'm going to raise your rent by $500. I'm going to raise your rent by X amount of dollars. All of that is stuff that renters have to deal with from the get-go. And then when they fall back and don't have the ability to pay for these things, whether they're out of work because they were a frontline worker, an essential worker, anything that puts them in a job, in a position where their income is subpar, whether it's minimum wage, which is clearly not a living wage, and I don't think in any part of the state, and their job doesn't have protections of like a union or something where they can be like, okay, this is a stable place for me to make money, good enough money to survive and live where I am. And that is just if they live by themselves. If they have a family, if they have a loved one that they're taking care of, all of these different things play a part into someone's ability and inability to deal with a lot of this process. And so when you have someone who knows the system, who's playing the system, such as the landlords and the attorneys, who can be like, okay, we can just do the bare minimum to get this renter out. We'll do the bare minimum. We're not going to tell them, oh, you can do X, Y, and Z. This is something that we really need to focus on. Say, hey, renters need a lot more protections. Right to counsel is a way to protect them, in addition to a bunch of other things that we can do for renters. And again, a lot of these things are really intertwined with one another. There's cities like LA, city and county of LA, they took the step towards establishing right to counsel. Again, it's never going to be easy. The fight, especially in a big city like LA, we know that big cities will need them a lot more. Then it's something that we really need to focus on, like in supporting, okay, how can we support folks who are introducing this legislation? How can we turn out to remind folks that this is something, whether it's signing a petition, signing a letter, doing a public comment, what can we do to combat all of the nonsense that we know is going to come from the landlords and folks that really focus on not wanting to protect tenants, not wanting to protect renters. This kind of goes into more stories about like how folks really, what the circumstances are that they're facing within these apartment complexes. It's not like, oh, this person's living in a fantastic apartment complex, fantastic apartment, and then they're getting booted out. A lot of time the conditions are really terrible. And that's terrible just to begin with. Like, this person is struggling to pay for a subpar living space, and to be booted on top of that with everything that they have going on, and then no right to counsel afterwards. You're on your own. There's no extra support that can be given to you because the system's not designed that way. So having right to counsel addresses one of those issues where when you get to the courts, when you are fighting this, when you know how to actually navigate the court system, the judicial system, it really allows you now to go in and like feel confident that even if you don't get everything you need, you at least had everything behind you to support you along this way. And whatever the lack of lawyers, I would say, is for this issue, the article goes into talking about like how it's hard for folks to find lawyers for this. And this, I think, is important to just note too. It provides 75% of them with, it's a gold standard of legal defense, an attorney to carry the case from start to finish. 75% is a lot more than the 5% of folks that have on nationally any kind of legal defense when it comes to these issues. So even if 25%, which is still something that needs to be dealt with, 75% is a hell of a lot better than the 5% that we're seeing right now. So this is something that as we go into this year and into the following years, we're going to see this a lot more. It's a fight that needs to be had, and a lot of our elected officials are fighting for it. I believe the LA one, if I remember correctly. The LA introduction was from council member Nithya Raman. I don't even know where it went. But I do believe it was council member Nithya Raman who we have endorsed previously in her first election and now in her re-election. These are fights that are worth having, and we need folks to actually fight for renters and tenants along the way there. So that is one of the things that I found as super important to highlight. It is a unfortunate circumstance and system that we're in right now, but it's not all doom and gloom. There are positives coming up, being sprinkled in there. So unfortunately, everything is still kind of gloom when we look at some of the bigger picture things. Where is the headline? There it is. 2023, I mean, this should not come as a surprise to anyone who's been following the news the last decade or more than that. 2023 was the warmest year on record. This is something that we really need to deal with as a whole. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I was reading through the article and it talked about, kind of like a bit of the science of why it was the warmest year on record, but it didn't really go into the responsibility of how we got to this point. It kind of left out the historical context. Not that you need to write like, this is the whole history of climate change within the country or in California or globally. This is just something that I felt like would be important to note, especially when we're talking about making change, when we're talking about something that really addresses the root causes of these things. And you get statements like this, is like, okay, in July of last year, in 2023, Earth's hottest month on record, 81% of the people on the planet experienced soaring temperatures made more likely by climate change. 81% of people on the planet. I don't remember if we're at 7 billion to 8 billion folks, but 81% is a staggering amount of folks in a single month, which was the Earth's hottest month. They experienced temperatures impacted more likely by climate change. And yes, one of the things I think is a big piece of this is the heat waves. If you see them here, you can see where they're listed out. You see China, Europe, North Africa, South America, and South Asia. We see no California listed. We see no United States here. We see no North America here. So there's a out of sight, out of mind piece of this where the heat waves aren't as prevalent to us if we are not familiar with it and like our attention to what is going on globally. So I'm not surprised that there wasn't this is the impact that this had in California because there were no major heat waves that some of the other parts of the globe saw. And then you get something like, okay, there's stuff in Phoenix, there's stuff in Florida, you get the typical Death Valley, which was 128 degrees, which is absurd. No, thank you. You get, again, talking about El Nino, you get talking about all the environmental climate aspects of these things. But you don't really get into why we have this. I mean, it's absurd almost that there's, we're nearing the end of the article. And if I remember correctly, we only get to the greenhouse gas emission piece again at the very end. Similar to the context of the property crime thing, we just don't get all of this stuff till the end here, where if you are just someone casually reading an article, you read up until a certain point and like, okay, the rest of the article is whatever. We know the impacts that climate change is going to have. The heat waves, the flood, the droughts, wildfires, you name it, it'll be exacerbated by this. And it talks about the damage being done by it. The damage being done by it will affect a lot more than just property damage or whatever. It'll impact lives. It'll force migration. You get to the Paris Agreement stuff. You get to all these things. But then there's nothing talking about how California and California policies have, I mean, for good and for bad, dealt with this in a positive and negative way. There's legislation in the legislature right now that could largely deal with this, whether it's where we're sourcing our wood from, whether we allow for more public transit, whether, and I'm not talking about like a greenwashing of environmentalism of like, oh, let's do more EVs, that'll solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem of a car-centric culture to just make more cars, even if they are EV. You get into the whole lithium issue, things like that. So none of this really talked about what was being done for California to address this. And I feel like it is a very missed opportunity when media covers this to not address what it is that was going on, and why we got here, and what could have been done in the last couple of cycles as folks are more in tune with this, but just chose not to do. There's divestment from fossil fuels, which is still a big ongoing issue. We still haven't fully divested from fossil fuels in a lot of different industries. There's still a lack of a Green New Deal. There's a lack of a just green transition for a lot of things. You get folks in Central Valley focused a lot on the oil industry still. Well aware, for the most part, of its effects on the folks in that community. They know that the folks there will eventually succumb to any of the environmental disasters that come from this continued pollution. Yet they still don't care because big oil, for the large part, just still funds their campaigns. They lobby them. I believe it was like 15 million of the last year, or in the last year, 50 million by big oil spent on lobbying of the legislators in Sacramento, and they've spent like 1.5 million in the last couple of election cycles to fund people's campaigns. So it's no surprise that they don't end up voting and passing legislation that needs to be passed here. But then who's going to challenge them on these issues? And so we like to support candidates who, in the state legislature for sure, will not take money from big oil, who will not fight back against the people who are being impacted the most by this, which is low-income communities, communities of color, working-class communities, regardless of race and ethnicity. This is something that impacts folks just across the board, and to be able to address this, we need folks that acknowledge where the actual issues are and what needs to be done to deal with them. You can't just like, okay, we're going to pass the buck and say, oh, this next generation can handle it. This is something that needed to be handled generations ago. And now we're stuck dealing with the outcome of their lack of inactivity and, frankly, their capacity to just make it worse. But I didn't want to end things on a negative note today. I did want to highlight a positive. In California, we are naturally, and as always, a bit ahead of the curve when it comes to generally legislation and progressive legislation, I would say, as a whole. We also are ahead of the curve on some negative things, too. But this is one of the benefits I saw recently, as this was something that California has been fighting for a while. AB 5, introduced by Lorena Gonzalez back when she was in the Assembly, who's now the Labor Fed chair. She introduced this as basically the way to reclassify gig workers through truckers, through anything like that, to really get folks, thanks for joining us, Landon, for truckers, for Uber employers, Uber employees, anything like that, to qualify as employees under California. It was pushed back. Prop 20, Prop 22, spearheaded by Uber and a lot of the big, basically gig worker economy people were funding an effort to overturn AB5, and they got it on the ballot. They spread a lot of misinformation about this, and they were like, you know what? We don't want to classify our workers as employees. And they would tell their gig workers, hey, this is something that negatively impacts you. You get to lose your freedom, you get to lose your autonomy, blah, 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 blah. All the kind of misinformation that folks normally spread against any time they could gain more rights and protections. This allows for folks to gain so much more benefits and protections once they get classified as employees. This is coming now from the full Labor Department, the U.S. full Labor Department on the national level. This, I would imagine, will still be under pushback, as the right and corporate forces will not be happy about this whatsoever. This, and it's almost this simple. It actually is this simple. Folks would have the right to a minimum wage, overtime pay, unemployment insurance, social security benefits. These are all not things that the employers currently are required to provide to independent contractors. And this is something that they have exploited for years now. Sometimes you'll hear ads talking about how Uber, Lyft, and such were in violation of labor employment laws. This is stuff that, again, we're seeing a system that will do its best to pay people the least amount possible to get them to do work that they should be paid more than a minimum wage for, honestly, a living wage, and then in addition with all the other things that they need. So this is a positive development. I didn't want to end on the whole global warming piece of it last year being the hottest year ever. But this is a positive development. Hopefully this gets more momentum in terms of implementation over the next year, ideally, but I don't think government works that fast. This, again, would take effect on March 11th. Who knows whether this will actually go through at that point? Again, possible litigation against these things, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and others for the ride-sharing delivery programs are going to push back on this. I didn't care to bother looking up if they've said anything about it, because they're going to say, oh, this is going to hurt our workers, blah, 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 blah. But I think that this is a positive development, and so I would like to give a shout out to them for really implementing this. But again, California was ahead of the curve on this in terms of actually passing legislation to protect and upgrade folks from being labeled as independent contractors to employers. Those are the big articles I actually had for today. I don't know if there's other things that folks have seen today that they would like me to cover, or my thoughts on it, or if I've seen things. Normally I would pull up Twitter, but I am smart and will refuse to pull up Twitter on my live stream because that is dangerous territory. And just for context again here, you get typical construction worker classified as an independent contractor earned less than 16,000 or 16,700 less a year in income and benefit than they would as an employee. And a typical home health aide took home 9,500 less in income and benefits. They're doing the same exact work. This is not anything that like, oh, they are doing less work because they work for Uber or Lyft or DoorDash or some other independent contracting company. They are doing the same exact work, but being paid substantially less for that without any benefits. And this is a change a long time coming, so I'm glad this is something that we were doing. Fingers crossed again that it goes through after the 11th of March. That is the big pieces I had for today. Again, thanks, Landon, for joining us. I'm going to try to do these more often. If folks have suggestions on what I should cover, I might just do this on a daily basis in the evening so folks can listen to this either in the evening when they get home from work or in the morning on the following day. The videos will stay up on YouTube, and fingers crossed, hopefully I get this up on Spotify or something. Don't expect to ever get paid from that, but making it more accessible to folks is always a good thing, so folks can listen to this anywhere they are. If no one has any other thoughts, thank you for tuning in for this super secret live stream. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, thank you folks for joining. I hope you found any of this part informative. I enjoy talking about these things, and I always feel like it's useful sharing this information and knowledge with folks, just so that they are aware of what's going on without having to dive in and read all these things on their own time. So share this with folks if you're interested. And if that is all, I will see you all probably tomorrow. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great Taco Tuesday. Hopefully you get something delicious to eat for dinner. Take care.